So this is the first of 6 webinars we're doing on Ayn Rand's political philosophy. My name is Ankar Gate, as I think you can see in the Zoom window. I'm at ARI, an instructor at ARI. I'm joined by Greg Salmieri.
Hello.
And Agustina, who is the TA in the course. So Greg and I are co-teaching this, and Agustina is helping us through the whole process. And so this, I said, is one of 6 webinars where we're exploring Ayn Rand's political philosophy. We're getting its basic principles, its essential concepts over these 6 weeks. And tonight, as I think most of you know, we're starting with the basic or foundational principle of individual rights when you're trying to study and understand Ayn Rand's political philosophy. So we're excited about taking this journey with you guys, and I hope you guys are excited as well. So Greg, you want to say a little bit more about sort of some of the aims and how we're approaching this?
Yeah, I'm thinking of this very much like I would think of a unit or a longish unit on Ayn Rand that you might teach in a wider course on political philosophy, one that would also cover other figures, either historical figures like Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes and Marx, or contemporary figures like Nozick or Rawls. So this is something like what might be a unit in a college course. That's one of the reasons why we have, as one of the questions we asked for today, what other views are you guys familiar with on this? Philosophy's, I think, usually best taught in that way, where you have contrasting views that you're discussing. But in this case, we're just doing Rand's view because it's meant to fill in the gap in a lot of courses that don't cover her. And maybe with that, it's a bit to say our perspectives on this and who we expect the audience to be, or who we're thinking the audience is. Maybe actually it makes more sense to start with what we're expecting, what kind of audience we're expecting. So when we started thinking about it, we are hoping to reach especially college students and young people, but really anybody who would be interested in taking a college course level treatment of political philosophy and would want to have a unit on Ayn Rand in it, or would want to have a supplemental unit on Ayn Rand. We expect we'll get people maybe from the libertarian movement, maybe some conservatives, but also, I hope, some more left-leaning people also who are just interested in this view. And I guess that's really all to say about the audience.
Yeah, and if we say something about ourselves, so I mean, I'm a senior fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. I consider myself an objectivist, so I'm an adherent to or advocate of Rand's philosophy. I think Greg would probably say something similar, though he's not at the Institute. But we're not, as Greg said, we're thinking of this as if it were a unit in a college course on political philosophy. And there's no presupposition in regard to the audience that they agree with this philosophy or will come to agree with it. And there's no such presupposition in the way we're going to approach discussion of the topics. And we certainly want questions, and if you have objections, if you don't agree with a particular idea, to feel more than welcome to voice that. That relates to the audience, that a variety of avenues. People have heard of Ayn Rand. You may have read The Fountainhead or Anthem in high school, and you found it a little intriguing and want to explore more. But there's no, I mean, that's what we want. There's no presupposition of agreement, and certainly agreement in advance of understanding the ideas. So we're trying to
not even really a goal of agreement. So this isn't about convincing you that Rand's right on any of these things if you disagree. It's just like in a college course, if you study Marx and then Locke, or with probably the other order, the point isn't to convince you of each of them or one of them in turn, but just to think about what these ideas are, think about what the arguments are, and of course, in this case, these are ideas that we are convinced of. And I think really the best teachers of any idea are the people who are convinced of it. I always loved when I could get a course on Kant with a Kantian or a course on Plato with a Platonist, because someone who's inside the system of thought in that way really can teach it best and can. I mean, when I'm teaching a view I don't agree with, I really work to kind of get my mind into the space of someone who would and try to showcase for the students how they would answer. And so it's a little less work to do it when you actually do agree. So we've said a bit about who we are. We've said a bit about who we think the students are, who we hope them to be. And maybe we should say a bit just about how we're going to proceed. We have a Facebook group, Seminar on Ayn Rand's Political Theory. I think most of you guys are already in it. We're posting questions in the Facebook group in advance of the session, and each session is built around a reading. This one's built around the article Man's Rights. We've posted the questions for this last week and also the questions for the upcoming session on Thursday, which is on the article The Nature of Government. And there's time to write in with responses to the questions, first thoughts on them. And we've looked at those, and Augustina's been interacting with people over those questions online. I have a little bit, and we'll do more so next week. This week I was in Europe, and well, I guess they have internet there, but I was busy. We'll be interacting a bit, and she'll sort of represent the sentiment of the Facebook group here in the chat. There's also a Q&A function here in Zoom, and you can write in questions you have there, and we'll try to answer them. And in addition to that, you can raise your hands from the participants panel. Is that right? And we'll try to take audio questions. And we might even throw out some questions, at various points to see if we get answers. We'll try to take audio questions from you. So hopefully you'll have a microphone on. Well, if you don't have a microphone and a quiet place to do it, don't raise your hand to ask an audio question. Just write a question into the questions panel. But if you are equipped to ask one responsibly, audio-wise, then feel free to raise your hand. We're hoping this will be interactive. We'd like to create the environment of a classroom as much as we can with this technology. Okay, so I think that's all the general procedures. You want to fill us in on the agenda for today, Onkar?
Yeah, sure. So we'll focus on the essay Man's Rights, and we're going to focus on the abstract principles that she's putting forth and explaining in this essay as against some of the derivative issues. For instance, she talks about the issue of the right to property, and we will talk about that a little bit today, but later in these 6 sessions, we will have a whole focus on thinking about property rights and some of the more details of Ayn Rand's view of the nature of property rights, how you formulate them, their importance. Similarly, the issue of free speech comes up in this essay in regard, you can think of it as part of the right to liberty. And we may touch on it a little bit here, but we will focus in the last of the 6 sessions on the importance of liberty, of freedom of speech, of freedom of thought, of, as Ayn Rand would sometimes put it, intellectual freedom. So we will be coming back to these issues. We're going to focus more for this session on getting an understanding of what she thinks the fundamental principle in regard to political philosophy is, and that's the principle of individual rights. And we're going to talk some about the context for this principle, then her the basic nature of rights according to Ayn Rand, and she addresses some, you can say, pseudo concepts in regard to rights, or pseudo formulations, or pseudo views, and we will contrast her specific view to the other views about rights. Certainly not all of them, but a few of the other ones. And some come up in the essay as well. We'll talk about that. You're muted, Greg.
Good. Okay. I had gotten muted, and I needed one of you guys to unmute me. And one of you did. Thank you. Okay. So let's start just diving into the essay, Man's Rights, by just looking at the first paragraph or two. So you didn't ask me anything more specific while I was struggling to get my sound back. Or did you? Okay. So if one wishes to advocate a free society, that is capitalism, one must realize that its indispensable foundation is the principle of individual rights. If one wishes to uphold individual rights, one must realize that capitalism is the only system that can uphold and protect them. And if one wishes to gauge the relationship of freedom to the goals of today's intellectuals, one may gauge it by the fact that the concept of individual rights is evaded, distorted, perverted, and seldom discussed, most conspicuously seldom, by the so-called conservatives. So we're getting an introduction here to and a motivation to be interested in the principle of individual rights at first, and then the concept of individual rights. And I think we should want to think about what this principle is and what this concept is and how they're related. We need to go a little further into the essay to get the content of that. But what this is starting with, kind of introducing us to the idea and motivating us around the idea that there is this crucial principle related to a crucial concept that is needed to defend freedom and that has gone missing from the discussion. So it's motivated around people who are interested in defending freedom. Now, where does this concept come from in the first place? Where does this principle come from in the first place? It's not like it's unknown entirely or hasn't been known entirely, right? It has some history. It's not a phrase that's new to Rand, individual rights, and she doesn't treat it as it. So where does this come from? Where does she think it arose? And this is one of the questions that we had asked. I forget the exact way we worded it. One of the questions that we asked on the Facebook group. I think it was question 1. So Augustina, do you want to fill us in on what our Facebookers had to say about that?
Sure. So for question 1, all participants in the discussions agreed on essentially the same. And there was one comment from Maria that summarized the gist of everyone's reply to the question, which was, Rand doesn't think the concept of individual rights nor their source has been grasped by most people because it is such a radically new way to think of rights. Throughout history, rights were commonly thought of as something that could only be given to man either by God or by society, not as things that man possessed by virtue of him being man. That's essentially what most participants agreed on.
Okay, does anybody now in the chat or elsewhere want to try to place this concept a little bit more in time? So it's radically new. Rand doesn't think that most people have understood it. When is it from historically? Any thoughts in the chat? Or someone says Locke. Someone says 1776. So we're getting a lot of Locke and 1776s. Locke's a bit back from 1776, but I think both answers are right. You could even go a little bit before Locke, but there's a tradition in Enlightenment or early Enlightenment philosophy, early modern philosophy, you could say. Locke is certainly the central figure here, or the most prominent figure. This is John Locke, the British philosopher. And it's somewhat implemented in the Glorious Revolution in England. There's a kind of history in British thought and Scottish thought and so forth going before and a little bit after that. And then, of course, it's a principle that is very influential on America's founders, and particularly we see it in the Declaration of Independence, right? The idea that men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, or in the draft, from their equal creation arises certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then, of course, in the Constitution, we have a Bill of Rights. So it's a radically new idea, not because it's new in the last 10 or 15 years when Rand was writing. She was writing this in the 1960s, but it's an idea that's new with this modern period in philosophy and new in its implementation with the American system of government, which he thinks is the first to really be based on this principle, although there are some precursors in British thought or British government.
I think having a historical perspective on this, and getting her perspective that she thinks it's a modern achievement, it helps get why you would make a distinction between the concept of rights and the principle. Because I think if one asked about the concept of rights or of individual rights, you can date it even further back than the Enlightenment, as they're starting to form this concept that an individual human being has rights that are relevant then for thinking about political questions and the questions of political philosophy. But putting it as the Enlightenment and then putting it as Locke, it becomes a principle as this is crucial to the whole subject of political philosophy and its foundations, that you will not get the foundations of political philosophy right if you don't get this as a principle. And what you can think of the founding fathers doing is they're establishing this principle as the foundation of government. So a Declaration of Independence is both that you possess certain inalienable rights and that the whole purpose of government is to secure these rights. And it's not just that they're instantiating the concept, but a certain principle. And that having that distinction helps one think about the history as well, I think.
We want to say a little bit, or do you have any thoughts on what the significance of the word principle is here? What principle means? Is it sort of a first thing or primary thing or foundation? This is the sense of the term you get in Greek philosophy, and you get in Enlightenment works like the principles, the mathematical principles of nature, Newton's Principia. Yeah,
I think that is part of the way it was thought of both in the Enlightenment and the way that Ayn Rand is thinking of it. It's a principle in that it's the concept of individual rights should form the base of political organization or the organization of society into a political unit. So it's the emphasis that this is the foundation around which everything else is built, and you have to trace back to this foundation.
Okay, good. We don't have any hands up, do we? I'm not seeing any. I'm not quite sure how that.
I think you would see the lower all hands active if some. Now
two hands just came up. Okay. Should we bring them into the chat? If I click, do we know how to make these hands work? Uncle, you've done this before, so.
Yeah, I mean, if we want the audio, we allowed to talk, so we can take Robert if you have a question. Yeah. Robert,
go ahead. Hi, Robert. Oh, he's muted. These people might have just put up their hand because I asked.
I've unmuted him, so you should be able to talk now, Robert.
Why not go back to Aristotle?
Why not go back to him?
Yeah.
Well, go back to him for what? I mean, he did have the concept of a principle, but I don't think he did have the concept of a right in the sense that Rand is talking about. She seems to have not thought he had it. Otherwise, she wouldn't have thought it was such a radically new concept.
You can't get that in his ethics, can you?
Well, the place to look would be his politics. And I am an Aristotle scholar in part of my other life when I'm not on YouTube here, but not as much of his politics as of some of his other works. But I mean, there is a book by Fred Miller called Rights and Justice, I forget the name of it, but Fred Miller's book on Aristotle's political philosophy does argue there's a kind of nascent conception of rights there. But and Fred may be right, but
I have the book.
If so, it's something that's not widely recognized in Aristotle, and so didn't become a sort of mainstream part of political theory until some millennia later.
Is it Natural Rights?
I think the title of the book might be Natural Rights and something else in Aristotle. I forget.
Yeah, I think I have it. I've just not got into it yet.
Okay, well, check that out for lines on how Aristotle might fit in here. I think Fred gives the most friendly to the view Ayn Rand comes up with reading of Aristotle you'll find, and then there's a question as to whether he is indeed as close as Fred has him. But if so, that's not the way everyone had interpreted Aristotle in the intervening millennia, or not the way many people didn't interpret him that way. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Thanks,
what about Spinoza?
Well, Spinoza's part of this early modern period with Locke. And I think I'm not an expert on Spinoza at all, but I think the Tractatus, the piece on free speech that he wrote, is a place to look, and I would put him in the kind of general tradition with Locke on this. Ankar, do you have any thoughts on Spinoza here?
Yeah, I think of it as he's part of the Enlightenment tradition. I'm not an expert on Spinoza either, and he's important as well for the separation of church and state. And I think of the real thinking about that revolves around a concept of rights as well. So that's further evidence that he's in this tradition.
Okay, so thanks, Robert, for putting these figures more on our radar. And I think Spinoza is more center of the page for this than Aristotle. Aristotle's role, insofar as it's there, is as a precursor. I think there are other earlier historical figures who we could think of as precursors to the traditions, arguably the Stoics, who I'm in general not too positive on, but there are some things in them that prefigure rights. Okay. Anyway, thanks, Rob.
Yeah, I have a question from Margaret. She asks, historically, what about the right of the Athenian to vote in ancient Greece?
That's actually a really good segue to one of the topics we had in mind. So the question here we want is, what is the role of the idea, or what is this principle of individual rights, right? That is, Rand is thinking is new. And what's distinctive about it? Because the idea of right and wrong is certainly older than that. Maybe some idea of someone having a right is older than that. But what's special with the concept of individual rights? And then how does it relate to the right of citizens to vote in ancient Greece? I mean, in any society, there were some people who were thought to have some authority or to be owed something, right? So it would be wrong to do certain things to certain people and right to obey them or right to afford them certain privileges. So there's right and wrong as applying to people in any society. So if there's meant to be something new in the concept of individual rights, it can't just be that. And it can't just be that some individuals are able to vote and others aren't. And, citizens can vote, non-citizens can't. Men can vote, slaves can't. There's something new, so the idea goes, in this principle of individual rights. And what is it? What is the really distinctive thing that Rand thinks this principle gives us? What's its function? And you can see it at the end of the second paragraph, right? So rights are a moral concept, she says, and it provides a transition from the principles governing an individual's action to the principles governing his relationship with others. It's the concept that preserves and protects individual morality in the social context, the link between the moral code of a man and the legal code of a society, between ethics and politics. And then here in italics is the crucial idea. Individual rights are the means of subordinating society to moral law. So individual rights are the means of subordinating society to moral law. And she goes on to discuss the idea that generally societies have been viewed as above moral law. Individuals, there's a moral law that applies to them that says how the individual should act, what he should and shouldn't do, what values he should pursue, and so forth. But, so the idea goes, that's not so of society. Society is empowered to do whatever it likes, whereas society is either the group of people represented by some king or ruler, or in the case of Athens, represented by the majority who had control of the society. And so the idea goes, they were unconstrained. They could do whatever they liked. And we see examples of this in Athenian society. They put Socrates to death, right, because they didn't like what he was saying. They ostracized people regularly, not just the colloquial sense of ostracism, but it was a formal practice. You would, everybody would vote to throw someone out of the city. Now, one could overstate the extent to which this is true of Athens, but the city had really expansive powers. And there were some sense that there are laws, there are rules to how the city should operate. But there's something really missing from it that is present in the concept of individual rights, and that's starting with the Enlightenment. And Ankar, do you want to talk about, or even the idea that there are some laws or there's some constraints on how the city function isn't yet this idea of individual rights, isn't yet subordinating it to moral law?
Yeah, so I think to get what you quoted from Rand, it's important when she says the link between the moral code of a man and the legal code of society. I think you have to read that as the proper moral code of a man and the proper legal code of a society. So I don't think her view is that there hasn't been some attempts to subordinate law or the use of force to moral constraints. She'll later put it in the essay of subordinating might to right. There's at least there's thinking about that issue. You can debate in when you're looking at the history of political practice and actual governments and so on, how much that idea is operative and governing in the actual functioning of a particular government in a society, of whether it's functioning in the idea that we have in some way subordinated might to right. But that, if you take Plato's Republic as one of the classic arguments in political philosophy of what a proper social political system looks like, he thinks of that as we have subordinated the social system to the right, morally right principles. That's what's governing in some kind of sense. But she's questioning is this at all a proper view of morality? So I think part of what she thinks of as what's radically new in the concept of individual rights is that the individual is at the forefront of all thinking about political questions. And if you've ever read parts or the whole of Plato's Republic, that's not what Plato's Republic is about. It's not the individual is front of center, and then it's how do we get a social system in which an individual, and I think on Rand's view, a rational individual can survive, flourish, live the kind of life that he's capable of living. So part of the subordination is placing the individual up high and saying that society, and particularly political legal structure, should be designed so as to make the life of the individual possible, that a good life. So I think that's one of the aspects when we're talking about subordinating. You have to bring in that aspect of the content to get to the way that she's thinking about it, and that this is radically new. And of thinking of, we'll talk more about this on Thursday, of the government as an agent of the individual. Contrast that to the way she's describing how it's been thought as government as ruler and you as subject. Now you're the citizen and the government's your agent. They're a means to your ends, not you're a means to their ends. And that I think there's more to it, to think about what is the concept and principle of individual rights. What is the problem it's addressing? But that's part of what is going on, that this is a radical rethinking of the relationship of an individual human being to his government or to society. And that's what's new.
Yeah, and in Plato, in the Republic, you get, and also the Laws and elsewhere, and the Crito, you get precisely the opposite of this, right? The individual, we don't want our society to be privileging the good of individuals, and what's best for the individual is going to be in conflict with what's best for the society. You don't want your society such that the best people will have what's best for them in it. That would be like painting the best part of a statue the best color, thinks Plato, and purple's the best color and the eyes are the best part, but it would be ugly to have a purple-eyed statue. You have to sacrifice what's best for the best part and for any individual part to make the whole good. So there's the idea of sacrificing the individual to the good of the society in Plato. I think that's in Aristotle too, although in a less obvious way, but there certainly isn't any idea of the society as the agent of the individual in Aristotle. At least I can't think of that. There, it is a bit more individualistic, but not to this strong extent. And other ancient theories, I think, are the same. So we'll talk more about this when we look at the article, The Nature of Government, last time, that there's always been, as part of thought of government, some thought about what its moral sanction is. And in that sense, the idea that society has to have some kind of moral code or moral justification. But the justification was never a justification to the individuals. It was never the individuals are primary, the individuals are what matters. There's a code about how the individuals are to be treated, and that's what government has to be held to. And that's what society as a whole has to be held to. And government is just, the primary institution of organizing a society, but we're talking about society as a whole here.
So I guess that's why Rand chose to say moral law in her formulation, because Jesse expressed doubt as to why Rand chose that expression on the Facebook group.
Now there's a couple of questions we might have about moral law. So is it why moral law as opposed to moral code or moral principles, or is it why moral as opposed to something else? I mean, what was it that people were pausing over with respect to the phrase moral law?
It was basically trying to get a distinction as to what's the difference between subjecting society to moral law different from actually legislating morality.
Okay, so that's a significant point. Ankar, do you want to come in on this, or should I just?
Yeah, because I want to say something else about, because I think there's probably another aspect that there's a concern about.
So go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it's the formulation of subordinating society to moral law can, I think, suggest that she's more in the natural rights tradition, because there's also the idea of natural law, than I think she is. So it is a little bit of a surprising formulation, I actually think. I'm not sure she uses it in any other essay of the moral law, but I think it's if you take the whole the whole paragraph, the moral code of a man and the legal code of society, and of subordinating to moral law, it's subordinating it to the principles of morality that are crucial to governing and organizing society. So it's not subordinating it to, or it's not, I mean, we'll talk more about this, but the issue of legislating morality, well, maybe I'll say something here too. I think this is a crucial aspect of what the principle and concept of individual rights has to be viewed as a solution. So had always been the question that if you subordinate might to right, so you're subordinating the use of force and government power and laws that are put forth by the rulers, you're saying these have to be justified, these have to have a moral justification. So we're subordinating the use of political force, of law, to moral principles. It had always, the thought then is, so what the purpose of a government is to legislate morality. It's to make people moral. And you see that in Plato, you see that throughout the Middle Ages, that a crucial part, if not the crucial part of the government, is to ensure that people are acting morally. And in the Enlightenment period, it became more and more, there's something wrong and deeply wrong about that. And yet it's not, well, forget about subordinating might to right. It's just the wrong way to think about subordinating might to right. And a crucial distinction that's made that I think Ayn Rand agrees with and is insisting upon and arguing a full case for is that you can't make people moral, but nevertheless, moral people need something from government. And what they need is that the conditions in which they can be moral, if they so choose, those conditions are established, secured, and protected. And the concept of individual rights is getting that this is a sphere of action in which you're going to be protected if you choose to embark on a moral life. But the government's not there to make you moral. And this had never been separated in thought that this is possible. It's either you abandon the idea of subordinating might to right, or you subordinate might to right, and then the government is the enforcer of morality, there to ensure that no one steps out of bounds. And if you have the wrong religion or the wrong beliefs, or you say the wrong thing, the government steps in and fines you, puts you in jail, and so on. And the principle of individual rights has a very different perspective on this. And that too, I think, is why she thinks of it as radically new.
Perhaps this is a good time to talk about the idea that this principle applies in a social context and what's meant by that, because we've been sort of assuming that in how we've been talking. She defines rights when she goes on to define them. We'll come to that definition in a little bit, as applying in a social context. And we could already see legal code of a society. Society is talked a lot, even in the second paragraph that we were just on about. So one thing you might think about rights, and I think the way a lot of people think about them, is that they're primarily about how a person relates to other people. And so maybe all of morality is about rights, and it's about what we have, what we can expect from or demand from one another. Because if you think morality is just about how you treat other people, then you might think all of morality is about what you owe to other people and what you have a right to demand from them. Now, Rand, of course, doesn't think that. She's an egoist, and she thinks that morality would apply even alone on a desert island, that there are things you need to do. The ultimate standard is your own life, and the ultimate standard is life, and your ultimate purpose is your own life, and you would need to act in certain ways to achieve your own life, to live your life, even if there were no one else around. And morality encompasses all of those things. Nevertheless, at some point you're dealing with other people, and you might think that rights are about how to deal with other people one-on-one, so to speak. And they're about what we owe to other people when we encounter them. But I still don't think that's quite right. That's not yet what's meant by a social context. And you could see it in the way she talks about it here, right? Rights provide a logical transition from the principles guiding an individual's action to the principles guiding his relationship with others. Note it's his relationship with others, not his relationships with others. So it's not about how the individual relates to this other individual and that other individual, how these two people relate. It's not about pairwise relationships, at least not primarily. It's about how the individual relates to others in general in a context where he's living with others in a society. And you can see it preserves and protects individual morality in a social context. So what's meant here by a social context? And I think it's not just two people interacting, but people living in a society. And a society is distinct from pairwise interactions, as distinct from just a family or a bunch of friends who have some, club someplace or something. It's a large group of people that don't know each other personally necessarily, who are interacting in a sustained way over time. There's a famous sequence in Atlas Shrugged where there's a group of people living together, I don't want to give spoilers, out of the way somewhere. And they say, we're not a society of any kind. Well, why aren't you a society? There are a whole bunch of you here and you live together, but they're personal friends who made a personal decision to live somewhere and to interact in a certain way. A social context is more than that. It's a whole society. It involves people being born into it and dying, strangers, what we would call a society. Any further thoughts on what's meant by society or social context? Or any questions about that?
Steve has a question.
Go ahead.
He says, the political order connected to the moral order, but not through the same morality, rules of playing the game versus principles and strategies for playing the game well. He's trying to contrast both things and get clarity on which one it is.
I'm not sure I follow what Steve's saying here. Ankar, do you have?
I suspect it's something like what I was talking about in terms of that the government is subordinate to moral principles or moral law, but you can think of that as its rules of the game or something like that. And then if you play the game well, that's up to the individual or something. I think it's trying to conceptualize something like that, but I wouldn't put it like that. I don't think of it as rules of a game and then playing the game well. It's as I put it, so put it non-metaphorically, it's that you have to establish a sphere of action in which the individual is free to operate. And that's part of when we talk about the definition of individual rights. It's in terms of an individual's freedom of action. You have to define that, establish it, secure it, and protect it in order for a person then to be able to take charge of his life and to live a proper or rational or a moral life, if that's what he chooses. And it's not, you're not playing the game that rules have been set up, I don't think that's the right way to think about it.
Yes, Steve follows up by saying that he's trying to pin down subordinate here. It seems like a hierarchical relationship of some sort.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the hierarchical relationship is the relationship between the society and the individuals. So you might think that the individuals are subordinate to the society. That's the view you find in Plato and arguably in Aristotle, and to the traditional view of how a society is structured. An individual stands to the society something like the way an organ stands to the organism. It exists for the sake of the larger whole. Its good is determined by the good of the larger whole. And so it can be sacrificed to the larger whole also. Whereas the view that the principle of individual rights goes to, the view that's kind of captured in the idea of individual rights, is the opposite, that the society is subordinate to the good of the individuals. The society is there for the individuals as their servant, for each and every one of them. And we have to figure out how to make that happen. But you can see, if you, again, follow the structure of the essay, we are talking about all these other societies that place the society above the individual. Unlimited majority rule or democracy in Athens, going back to the question about the voting there, the welfare state run by the emperors of Rome, the Inquisition in the Middle Ages, Bismarck's Prussia, Nazi Germany, etc. All the systems are expressions of an altruist ethics, but more specifically, the idea that the society stood above moral law as sovereign over the individuals. And in that sense, they were an amoral society. Even if there was some kind of moral code of some sort that was meant to stand by it, it wasn't a true one. And it wasn't one that made the society deferent to what it should be deferent to morally, at least according to this principle of individual rights, deferent to the individual. And so that now brings us to well, now we get stated again where historically this is. It's the United States of America that first implemented this principle. Somebody said in the chat earlier, Athens didn't really have it because it had slavery. Well, that's true, but the United States, of course, had slavery as well. I think the essential difference between the United States and Athens, though, is the idea here again that in the United States, the society, the government, is meant to be subordinated to certain rights that are inherent in the individual. And the whole point of the government is to provide that. And then it's a tragic flaw in the American system of government as implemented in the first generations, that they didn't recognize those rights in the case of all individuals. And they had slavery, at least in some of the states.
And if you think of it from the perspective of the individual to society, or to individual and the group, and to go back to the issue of the democracy in Athens, if the majority in Athens say that slavery is fine and it should be established in the law, that's all there is to it. And yet you can think for the US that the majority may have thought that slavery is okay at the time of the founding, and yet it nevertheless contradicts the foundational principle, because it's not, the foundational principle is not majority rule. The foundational principle is that an individual has certain rights, and you can't negate that even if the majority disagrees with it.
Looks like Paul has a question here in the webinar chat. I guess I could read it. For Rand, is she referring to the moral law as what she defines as the objectivist ethics, or does she mean moral law as placing the individual above the group, or perhaps the moral law as the prohibition against initiating force? I don't think it has to be, if we're talking about the American founding, which she is, she can't be talking about the full content of the objectivist ethics, either that essay titled The Objectivist Ethics or her moral philosophy, because that hadn't been devised yet. But I do think she's, it's not like she came up with morality from scratch when she did, right? I mean, she did rethink it from the beginning. And in that sense, you could say she came up with it from scratch. But many of those moral truths had been recognized before. In some form, implicitly, or some of them explicitly, right? And it's those true moral facts, which she gives a fuller elaboration of and more systematic presentation and defense of in pieces like the Objectivist Ethics, but which were grasped, some of them in some form earlier, that society is being made subservient to. And maybe this is an occasion also to answer something Ketvan was asking live, or was asking in the Q&A, which is, can we say something about the relationship between Rand and Aristotle here, since Aristotle was mentioned? And in ethics, right, there's this idea in Aristotle that there's each human being should be after, and it's natural for him to be after, and it's right for him to be after, and to be living his life for the sake of eudaimonia. his own, sometimes it's translated flourishing or happiness, to make the most of his own life in accordance with human nature. There's a certain way built into human nature or based on human nature for human beings to live. And each of us should try to realize this most fully. Each of us should try to, in Rand's language, live a life qua man, you might say, or live as a human being. And again, there's a particular theory of what virtues this requires, of what kind of a life this is. And I think Rand agrees with that, very broadly speaking, but she has a somewhat different view of what the virtues are. In particular, productiveness is really important to her in a way it wasn't to Aristotle, and that really transfigures things. And she has, whereas for Aristotle, it's a bit woozy how we tell what things are part of man's life. Reason certainly is, and is central to it, but how we tell what particular things it is and what kind of life it is. Rand has I think a more exact way of validating what goes into it. It's based on biology and the alternative of life or death. But in any case, there's this agreement that individual human beings have as their proper purpose, you might call the pursuit of their own happiness. And now what Rand is saying is that what we get in the Enlightenment, in the American founding, is the idea that the purpose of the state and the purpose of society is to enable the individual to lead his own life and to pursue his own happiness. And government needs to be made consistently subservient to that purpose. And that we need to define explicitly principles to hold government to and to hold one another to in order to accomplish that, in order to make it the case that society is subservient to the individual's ability to lead a human life.
Greg, you brought up the Enlightenment, and Alexandra made a comment on the chat earlier that I think is interesting, and I would like to hear your thoughts. She says, the difference between the view held by thinkers in the Enlightenment and the view held by Rand are different. They attributed rights as given by the Creator, meaning the Enlightenment thinkers, while Rand attributed them to man's nature and the conditions necessary for his survival.
Yeah, so we should really go, before trying to answer that question directly, and talk about the way that Rand grounds and derives the concept of rights. And then we can kind of spiral back or cycle back to how is it different from the Lockean version, or the version we find in the Founders, which tend to reference God, or tend to say that these rights are there in nature. And the first of those Rand certainly opposes. She was an atheist. And the second is in a way closer to her view, but I don't think exactly right. And I think there are important differences. So let's maybe move to just first say a word about her definition of life, rights, and then the passage which is really quoted in this essay from Atlas Shrugged, the novel, where we get the kind of basic statement of where rights come from. Ankar, do you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, so if we take the definition of rights, so quoting from Ayn Rand's essay, it's, quote, a right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context, unquote. And so it's a man's freedom of action. And this is, so we've talked about elements of all of this. It's a man's freedom of action. So you're trying to establish a sphere in which an individual can independently exercise his mind and act in the pursuit of his own happiness. And that he doesn't have to consult with anyone. He doesn't need anyone's permission. He knows that there's a sphere in which he operates by himself, by his own judgment, decisions, choices, and he can make the most of his life, or as little of it as he chooses. And then to say it's a moral principle defining it, it establishes explicitly. This is part of the function of rights, that you need this concept, you need it explicitly. If I know I have freedom of speech or freedom of thought or freedom to earn property, I know, okay, if I take these actions, this is the sphere in which I can operate according to my own judgment. I don't need anyone else's permission. I don't need to consult with anyone else. And I'll be protected if people start to encroach in this sphere of action. I'll know, because it's been defined, this is my sphere. I'll know people are encroaching in it, and I can take action, which is basically petitioning the government that, look, someone's interfering with my freedom of action here that has been defined. And sanctioned means you have morally, you're entitled to this. So I've got now a claim. It's clear that you're encroaching, and you're encroaching on a sphere in which I should be able to act freely, and you shouldn't be entering. So I'm in the right, you're in the wrong, and that now I appeal to government that this has to be addressed because something is going wrong. And in a social context means you need this concept when you've got the complex interactions that occur in a society, when you deal with people you don't know, they're not your friends, they're strangers, you want to be able to deal with them, but certain principles have to be established by what those interactions, how those interactions will take place and govern. And I think the definition is meant to encapsulate these various aspects of the proper foundation of a political system or political organization.
Good. I have some more to say about the defining aspect of it, but I think it'll be better to go further into that once we've talked about what the rights are. So let's talk about the source of rights and the derivation of them, and then we'll be in a position to say a bit more about Alex's question, and we can also then come back to the definition again in light of the particular rights. So we get again this idea of how new the concept is, but what is the I don't know. I'm at a crossroads in my thinking. It might be that it would be better to talk about the basic rights and the relationship between rights and actions before we talk about the derivation in Galt's speech. That's actually the order it goes in the essay, or that's different from what we discussed before. So, so the right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. Man here, of course, is a generic that's come a little bit out of favor in writing these days, but any individual, any human being, right? A human being's freedom of action in a social context, a man's freedom of action in a social context. And she goes on to say that it's the fundamental right is the right to life, right? So, well, even before that, right, there's the idea of rights are about action. So it's the sphere in which you are able to act unilaterally, in which your unilateral action is sanctioned. And then we get the idea that the right to life is the source of all rights. And this goes again from this idea of what I mentioned when I was talking about the relation of Rand and Aristotle. The individual is properly trying to lead a human life and just more generally trying to live. And living is something you do. Living is an action. Life is an action. It's a process of activity. And the right to life, which is the fundamental right, is the right to take that action. So the idea is rights are principles defining and sanctioning an individual's freedom of action. And the fundamental action or set of actions that an individual must be free to take are the actions that constitute the individual's life. The actions of living. There's an activity of living for a human being, and a human being needs the freedom to engage in that activity. And then the rest of the rights are going to spell out, well, what is that activity? What is the activity that it is to lead a human life? So that we can see in more detail what sphere does an individual need to be free in? What is the sphere in which an individual needs to be able to act unilaterally when he's in a social context?
And if you think of it from the perspective of what we were earlier talking about, of subordinating society to moral law, it's the individual, he has a certain type of life that he has to be able to lead. And if a society then interferes or somehow prevents him from taking the kinds of actions that he has to be able to take, it's illegitimate to that extent. And that's the issue of how the subordination runs. You look at the legitimacy or illegitimacy of society's actions from the point of view of the individual.
Yeah. And then also of other individuals within society's actions. So the society as a whole could infringe on one of my rights, or some other person in the society could. So that's I think once you see it as life as the fundamental right and life as action, it helps to make clearer why defining is here. Because we're trying to understand what is the scope of an individual's life, particularly when individuals are living in a social context, on top of one another, so to speak, acting in ways in which their actions overlap and the things with which they're interacting overlap. And they're doing things in the same space. And it can be unclear in that context where one individual's life ends and another individual's life begins. Where one individual's mind needs to be sovereign and his decision has to be the one that's followed, and where another's does, because lives can start to overlap. And so we need to make explicit what the boundaries are around each of our lives so that others don't interfere with them, and so that we have a way of adjudicating it when other people do.
Megan brought up a question on Facebook related to the relationship between the right to life and the right to property, and I will quote her. The sentence, "The right to life is the source of all rights, and the right to property is their only implementation," seems to connect the fact that the need for rights is a distinctly human characteristic, and that the need to produce is a distinctly human characteristic as well. Can you expand on this connection?
There were a few comments on this, and we had a whole question, I think, right, on the right to property, didn't we? So there were also a few other comments on this. One thing to say is we will say some about it tonight, but we're going to have a whole session on the right to property a couple of weeks from now. Ankar, do you want to say a bit about it now?
Yeah, I'll say a bit about it, and again, connecting it to a couple of things that we talked about before. So Greg talked about in comparing and contrasting Ayn Rand's view and Aristotle's view in regard to ethics or morality, that she emphasizes the virtue of productiveness in a way that doesn't have a parallel, I think, at all in Aristotle. And this, the virtue of productiveness, or sometimes how it would be put in the Enlightenment and with Locke, it would be put as industriousness. So if you think of the Industrial Revolution, the kind of mindset that went into creating something like the Industrial Revolution is the importance of producing, of creating the new, that you can build wealth and wealth upon wealth, and it's an accelerating process, and it's an ever-growing process. This is part of what the Enlightenment is discovering, I think, this fact about human beings and the way that human beings survive. And it's again something new. And then you're getting a moral political attempt to conceptualize this, to say, okay, this is a virtue. This is something good about people insofar as they're pursuing their own life and real happiness. They've got to devote themselves to this kind of activity and this kind of life. And then you have to be able to lead that kind of life in a society. And this is why the issue of property becomes such a big issue. It's we can make things, we can produce, we can create, and you have to have control over that process. You have to be able to venture into the new, to develop whether it's new inventions or just to go farm land that has been barren and nobody is using. You have to be able to do that, and then you have to be able to keep the results of your action. But the fundamentals, you have to be able to take this kind of action and then gain the rewards if you've taken that kind of action. And this is a new view that's coming in the Enlightenment. And it's something then that Ayn Rand thinks of as she's giving a fuller case and grounding, because she gives a deeper perspective, I think, on why productiveness is a virtue and central to the moral life.
Yeah, you can think about it as, well, what is the process by which human beings live, right? And it's a process of creating. But in the process, it's a process of creating. It's a process of making things, of creating the values that then sustain your life. And so it has, a productive and a consumptive phase. And if a human being is to live, if he's to engage in the activity in which a human life consists, it can't be that his productive phase is cut off from the consumptive phase. Sounds like he has cholera, but the phase where he consumes. He has to be able to make something and then do the consuming for the sake of which he made it. Or here's another way to think of it. Part of what we do part of what it is to live is you incorporate aspects of your environment into the process of your living, right? So if you eat something, the thing you ate becomes part of you. It becomes literally part of your body and part of the organs by which you live. But also if you, pick up a stone and sharpen it, if, thinking back in caveman days, right? You pick up a stone or flint and you sharpen it, and now that stone is the weapon that you use to kill an animal or whatever it is. That thing has become part of your life. It's no longer just the rock that it was out there in nature independent of you. It's become a part of you, a part of the process by which you live, in something like the way your hands are and your bodily organs are. So life is a process of creating things and of incorporating values into our lives, incorporating material objects into us, into the process by which we sustain ourselves. And to have the right to live means to have the right, includes to have the right to engage in that process, which means the right to create things, to make things of value, to make things part of your life, and then to have the kind of control, to have control over those things so that you can use them for the sake of the ends for which you made them. But this again then gets us to the issue of the importance of defining here, because if a whole lot of us are doing this in the same area, there are going to just naturally come up questions. Wait, is that your rock that you were doing it with? Oh, you cleared this area of land. Does that mean that you're using it and I can't walk over it? And we're going to need to understand that each of us is doing this kind of a process here, and come up with a way to demarcate what things I've incorporated into my life and what things you've incorporated into your life, what things are yours and what things are mine, so that we have clarity on what things for me to do would be to interfere with your life, would be to infringe on your right to life, because they'd be to infringe on your property, which is in effect part of your life. So this is the right to property is not the right to an object, right? But to the action and consequences of producing or earning that object. And it's the right to gain, keep, use, and dispose of material values. So again, it's always a right to do something.
One other point that it takes us a little, it's a little bit of an aside, or it's going to a wider issue, but I think it's important in thinking of her approach to rights and the Enlightenment approach as well. And this issue of productivity, it will, in the more economic kind of conceptualization, it will be put as, well, if there's a fixed pie, and that if one person takes, there's nothing left, or there's less left for the other person. And you see this in Locke and other of the Enlightenment thinkers. There's a challenging of this idea, and I think it's very important that this idea is being challenged, because it's part of getting a proper conceptualization of production, that you can keep increasing the amount of wealth in the world. Of what production is taking raw material resources and reshaping them so they're of use to yourself and to other human beings when you trade. And the level of wealth grows over time if people are able to be productive. So, and Locke gives this kind of example. So you might think that, well, the person who takes a piece of land and then starts farming it, well, now we've got less land to pick from and so on. But what he's done is taken a piece of land that nothing was growing on, or maybe just a few sheep could graze on. And he's taken it and he's reformed it so that it is now creating something valuable that everyone who now is doing a similar kind of thing, you can engage in trade and so on. And so there's this growing level of prosperity that's possible to all the individuals. And this emphasis on production is helping them conceptualize that the way it will be put often is it's a dog-eat-dog world, and one person's gain means another person's loss and so on. And the Enlightenment period that's moving into the Industrial Revolution is, I think, blowing up this view that it's all wrong and it's not the way to think of at least the potential of a human society. And if you realize that, then the importance of property, it is really highlighted.
It's worth emphasizing here that the very individuals who were the kind of key thinkers of this period, particularly in America, were people who were industrious, right? And who were inventors. I mean, Jefferson invented the dumbwaiter and a device to, you could, if you go to Monticello, you see all these things Jefferson invented. He was an inventor and wrote the Declaration of Independence about rights. Benjamin Franklin invented the bifocal and the glass harmonica and the lightning rod and a bunch of other things. These were people who were actively involved in this process of creating new kinds of property, inventing things. We're very in touch with the fact that this is a key part of human life. And again, Thomas Paine, who wrote the essay, The Rights of Man and Common Sense and some other things, when he was in France, he was writing back to Congress, all excited about his designs for iron bridges and the iron bridges he's seeing everywhere. These are people who were really onto the idea that that life doesn't have to stay like it is now, that the level of technology we're at, the way we're living now in the material realm, doesn't have to always be the same. We can create new things. We can make better machines, better ways of doing things, better technologies. We can improve the world in this way. And physically, we can create new values. And that is very much connected to their thinking. We can create new types of society and to the new type of society they want to create. Let's talk now about this passage from the speech in Atlas Shrugged that gives the kind of real grounding of rights, and her, I think, gets us back to Alex's question earlier about how her view is different from the founders, and then we can talk a little bit more about some of the topics on which there's more continuity between them, about the relationship between rights and obligations. Onkar, do you want to start us off on that passage, or should I?
We probably should read it.
Okay.
So let me read it. So this is quoting from the essay, but she's quoting from a passage from Atlas Shrugged. So, quote, "The source of man's rights is not divine law or congressional law, but the law of identity. A is A and man is man. Rights, or conditions of existence, required by man's nature for his proper survival. If a man is to live on earth, it is right for him to use his mind. It is right to act on his own free judgment. It is right to work for his values and to keep the product of his work. If life on earth is his purpose, he has a right to live as a rational being. Nature forbids him the irrational. And close quote from Atlas Shrugged, and close quote from the essay. And you can see here the emphasis on the, as she puts it, the conditions of existence required by man's nature. So this is given what an individual human being is, and given the nature of the world or the reality in which he inhabits, this is how he has to act in order to pursue his life and happiness. And those conditions are set by his nature and the nature of the world in which he interacts. And in part, the concept of rights, or the principle of rights, is acknowledging, or is based on the recognition of this fact. And that this is crucial to her view. And a word about just, and then I know, Greg, there's other things you want to say about this. When she puts it in terms of a principle or a concept, I think it's important that the way that she thinks of both a concept and a principle, she will often give, she'll talk about concepts as they're tools of cognition. They're tools of knowledge. We make these in order to make possible advances in our knowledge and then our action. And I think this is how she's thinking about rights. It's so on the idea of it, that these, though they have a basis in reality, in the nature of a human being and the world in which he interacts, they're not like diamonds that you dig up and find a raw diamond. That's not what a right is. It's a tool, and a tool is something we make, we fashion, but you're doing it on the basis of reality, because it's a tool that you want to be able to use to advance your goals in reality. And this is how I think she's thinking, and why she puts it as it's a principle and a concept. It's something we make, and it's solving a problem that we've been talking about how properly to organize society. So that's a little bit on its foundation and the way she's conceptualizing it.
Yeah. For people who are familiar with the distinction Rand draws elsewhere between the objective, the intrinsic, and the subjective, and we'll talk about that distinction in a couple of, next week, for those who aren't familiar with it. The idea is that rights are objective rather than intrinsic or subjective. So for people who that's helpful to, note that here, and for the rest of you, we'll come to that next week when we read the essay, What is Capitalism?, where that's discussed. I just want to step through this paragraph because there's a lot going on here, and it's connected to a lot of what people have been asking us. So the source of man's right is not divine law nor congressional law. So we're differentiating Rand's view or she's differentiating her view from two other views. Congressional law would mean that rights are determined by society, right? Determined by Congress or by people voting. Divine law would be endowed by his creator with certain inalienable rights. So the view that you get explicitly stated in the Declaration, the draft of the Declaration is a little different. It's from this equal creation, which I think is closer to her view, the rights derived. But Locke certainly, talks about God as a source of rights also. But it's not divine law nor congressional law, but the law of identity. Okay, how is that? Well, A is A thing is what it is. That's the law of identity. And man is man. So man has a certain identity. Now, if you think about Rand's ethical theory, and in earlier in this speech in Atlas Shrugged, a lot of the foundations of her ethics have been laid out. And there's the idea that morality rests on an axiom and a choice. The axiom is that existence exists and that things in existence have identity. Everything is what it is, and in particular, human beings are what we are. Each human being is what he is, and the world is what it is. And the choice is to live in Rand's ethics. So if you want to live, if you want to exist, given what reality is and given what you are, you need to live in a certain way. And we see that this, if we skip to the next sentence, if man is to live on earth, It is right for him to use his mind. It is right for him to act on his own judgment. It is right for him to work for his values and to keep the product of his work. Okay, so there we get a little synopsis of part of Rand's moral code. And for the people who were asking earlier, is the moral law that's relevant here Rand's objectivist ethics? And I said, yes, but not necessarily all of it and in all the detail of it. Well, here's the kind of core of what you need. If a man is to live on earth, it is right for him to use his mind, right for him to act on his own judgment, and right for him to work for his values and keep the product, because a human being is an entity of a certain nature that can only live on earth if it conducts itself in those ways. But that's what is right to do. What we're talking about in this essay is rights, which is what? Well, it's a principle defining and sanctioning freedom of action in a social context. Here in this passage from Atlas Shrugged, right, she says, rights are conditions of existence required by man's nature for his proper survival. Well, what kind of conditions of existence? Presumably the freedom in a social context, given what we're seeing from the rest of this essay. So it's the condition of freedom in a social context required by man's nature for man's proper survival. That is, for man to live in this way, which in the speech in Atlas and in the objectivist ethics, she says really is the only way a human being can live, barring chance and some other things. Okay, so if it's right for a human being to live in this way, and he therefore requires conditions, social conditions to live in this way, then if life on earth is his purpose, he has a right to live as a rational being. Nature forbids him the irrational. And what does it mean for him to have a right to live as a rational being? It means that his freedom of action should not be impinged upon in a social context. Now, there's a worry, and a lot of people have pointed out about this passage, that there's this move from it is right for him to do something to he has a right. And I've said a bit about how I think that works. But then when I start to say what it means to say he has a right, we start getting to, well, it starts telling us what other people should do, that they shouldn't infringe upon it. How are we to understand this? What's the significance of this transition from it is right to one has a right? Does anyone have any thoughts on this in the group now? Or Ankar, do you want to say anything about it?
I mean, let's see if anyone wants to venture in here. Again, you either need to post a question in the Q&A or raise your hand in the participants panel.
So Scott asked a question that I think we just addressed, so I'm going to click that one as addressed. What are we getting, Steve?
Mark says, this brings up the question of man qua man and what it means to be rational.
Yeah. And Steve's saying this puts her in the natural rights tradition, but he's worried about different senses of right, so maybe that there's an equivocation here. All right, shall we move ahead? We're not getting direct answers to what I was asking, which is what is the significance of that move? The transition, here we have Megan saying, the transition in the Atlas paragraph seems to connect morality, how one should conduct oneself, to rights, ethics in a social context. And Jeremy is saying, I always thought the word right meant two things. Right is in proper, and right is in a thing one has. And in particular, well, that's what's interesting about it, because is the right a thing one has? What does it mean if the right is a principle, defining and sanctioning your freedom of action in a social context? or the right is a condition of your proper society, what does it mean to say you have a right?
Alexandra brings up a distinction. She says, for something to be right is for it to be conducive to his continual flourishing. For someone to have a right to something is to be able to do it without violating anyone else's rights.
Ankar, do you want to respond to that or follow up on this?
Yeah, I think part of what to get she's emphasizing not just the relationship of the ethics and the politics, but of where both are coming from. So, and she would put it, I think, in the end of a metaphysical perspective, a perspective on the fundamental nature of reality and of man. So that when it's rights or conditions of existence required by man's nature for his proper survival, this is a fact about human beings given the nature of the world, that there's certain conditions or there's certain types of actions that advance his life, and there's other types of actions that are detrimental to his life. And then if it is Greg you were emphasizing that there's an element of choice in regard to morality, that this is what's required in order to live, but you have to choose that and then choose to to learn and enact the means to truly be pursuing your life. And it's similar, there's a similar perspective in political philosophy that and if you think again of the founding fathers, they're consciously designing or redesigning a social system. And it's on the premises, if man is to live on earth, but if you think of it from the perspective of the founding fathers, I think you can say, we want to live on earth. We're choosing to live on earth. And then it's right for an individual to use his mind. It's right to act on his own free judgment. And so these are the things that are morally right and have to be protected, and they're sanctioned and therefore have to be protected in a social organization. And that's part of what it means that you're subordinating to society, to moral law. You have a perspective of morality, and we're making a definite choice here, and now we're making good on that choice. And these are the necessary means of making good on that choice.
Yeah, so you could say that the perspective on rights is conditions of proper survival, right? Those conditions are there whether anybody acknowledges them or not. So I have to choose to be trying to survive, but there's only certain conditions under which I can do it, and those are just true by nature. So there's certain kind of just what's there in nature perspective on it that we're getting in this phrase, rights are conditions on his proper survival. But the fuller perspective on them is a condition on your proper survival, doesn't tell anybody what to do, all on its own. But when we think then about creating a society, if we want it to be a society in which individuals are able to survive, and we understand that a society, what a society is for individuals to be able to survive, then those conditions become principles defining and sanctioning the scope of action that a human being needs to be able to engage in unilaterally in order to survive. And if you go to the passage after this paragraph that's quoted in Atlas Shrugged, we immediately get a discussion of an individual could act against the requirements of his nature, but he'll die. And a society could act against the conditions, against rights, but a society that tries to do that will be a slave society and it won't be successful. And the whole context of where this speech is occurring in the novel, it's very clear that a society that is functioning on a non-rights basis is not faring well at this point in the novel when the speech is made.
Alexandra brings up an example. She's saying, being an alcoholic is immoral because it is self-destructive to that individual, but it does not violate anyone else's rights because it does not impede them from pursuing their own well-being.
Yeah, I think that's right. But what I'm more interested in at this point, I think we need to be more interested in at this point than the distinction between doing what's right and what violates someone's rights is what is the connection between the two. So where do these rights come from? They're related in some way to what's right. If you go to the most fundamental things that are right, not whether to take a drink or not, or how much to drink, but that you need to use your own mind to determine whether to drink or not and how much, and in general to direct the course of your life, then that's a kind of fundamental thing that it's right to do. And then it's a condition on your ability to survive and to live as a human being that you be free to make that choice. And therefore that what you drink or not is up to you, rather than being up to whoever was in charge of prohibition.
I'm just doing a time check. So we're 90 minutes in. I think we forgot to say this at the start. These are going to be 90 minutes to 120 minutes. I think this one's going to go 120 minutes. And we're dealing, as we said at the outset, we're dealing with the foundational issue for understanding Ayn Rand's political philosophy. So I think it's important to spend an adequate amount of time on this issue. But Greg, to think about, we should talk, I think, about the issue of rights and obligations a little bit, and we asked about that. Yeah. And I think we should talk for sure a little bit about the issue of what Rand thinks of pseudo-rights and that issue that comes up. I think those at least are two for sure that we need to talk about.
Yeah, and then there are a couple of questions I want to get to. There's also, you would think we would spend a lot of time on rights and force, but actually force is a major topic we're going to be talking about next time. So if we have time, we'll say something about it now. But it's okay if we end up just postponing force until.
And it is. I mean, we'll talk about this for sure next time. The discussion of force, it's much more in the next essay, The Nature of Government, than it is here. And I think that's important for her view and understanding it.
So why don't, which was the first of the two that you wanted?
The issue of rights and obligations.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, and then more briefly about pseudo rights, and then we'll after rights and obligations, I think I want to do one or two of the questions, and then pseudo rights.
Okay.
So why don't you start us off on rights and obligations?
And I forget, Agostina, was there? Do you want to say a little bit about sort of what the general consensus was, or general thrust of the answers in regard to this question that we asked about?
Which question are you exactly referring to?
This would have been question 2. Particularly the issue of obligations as raised in question 2. Mm-hmm. I think people more picked up on the other aspect of the question than that one, so there might not be that much.
Yes, there is not much. They were more linking moral law, like morality, to rights, and the link between the moral code of a man and the legal code of society, as Harry put it in Facebook. So there's not much about obligations.
I'll say a couple of things, and then Greg, if there's anything you want to add on the issue of obligations. So, to the way that she formulates it in the essay, just to read the sentence. Well, two sentences. Thus, for every individual, a right is the moral sanction of a positive, of his freedom to act on his own judgment, for his own goals, by his own voluntary, uncoerced choice. As to his neighbors, his rights impose no obligations on them except of a negative kind, to abstain from violating his rights. Close quote. So part of the perspective of getting, these are rights to freedom of action. They require for you to be secure in your possession of rights. They require no positive action on the part of your neighbor. There's nothing that he must do. There's no particular action that he must take. Indeed, if to use some imagery that Ayn Rand uses when just discussing morality, I mean, if a person chooses not to live and just sit in the corner and die, they can do that and they're not infringing on someone's rights. Another perspective, though, to think about the issue of obligations that she uses in some other context that I think is important in getting them in regard to principles. She says they impose one obligation, an obligation of consistency or of rationality. And that, in terms of thinking about them as principles, it's, I'm claiming that this principle applies, that this is how society properly should be organized around the principle of individual rights. I have a right to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, and I should be secure in these rights. You're in the wrong if you trespass on them. This is in terms of a principle. It's not something that applies to me, but not to the other individuals around me in society. A very grasp of this, and then to claim it, is to recognize this is true of everybody. This is, I'm sure sometimes put it as man qua man. This is true of the individual. What we've been talking about in terms of the grounding of individual rights, it applies to each and every individual human being. So to claim these, that is to say this principle applies to me, is part of that is to recognize it applies to other people as well. And so in that sense because I think there was some discussion of this in the Facebook group, well, doesn't it impose an obligation to respect the rights of others? And in that sense, can't you think of it as a positive in some sense? And I think in terms of thinking, if you can think of it as a positive, the positive is to be rational and consistent in regard to this, and to recognize that the case you're making applies to every individual. And this is part of then just thinking in regard to slavery, of saying there's something was deeply wrong about the whole, it's because we're enunciating these as principles that apply, and if you think of what the grounding of these apply to every individual, but here's a whole class of people that we're not going to apply this to. And it's a major contradiction. And that she thinks is unacceptable.
Should we say something about how this demand for consistency, this view of principles, and the idea that there's an obligation to respect the rights of others relates to Rand's egoism? I mean, you might think that to say there's an obligation means you're obligated to do it whether or not it's good for you. And yet, if you're an egoist, you're meant to do only what's good for you or right for you.
Yeah. I mean, you want to say a word on that? I mean, I can just say that this connects. I mean, you can say particularly about the egoism, but this connects to the whole view of property and of thinking of individuals as, and your relationship with individuals as you can engage in enormously productive interrelationships of trade, of exchange, of growing and learning together and living together, that all, so the perspective of viewing another individual, qua an individual and what their potential is as somehow a threat to you, you should have a very different perspective than this. And this, again, the Enlightenment is bringing about. It's an enormous respect for the individual that you should have from an egoistic perspective. That is, from the perspective of you pursuing your own happiness.
Yeah, I've written, well, I wrote a whole piece on the egoism and rights for a book that's forthcoming. It'll be out in March, and Ankar also has some pieces in it. It's called Foundations of a Free Society, Reflections on Ayn Rand's Political Philosophy, and I edited it with Robert Mayhew. So I won't try to summarize my essay here there, but just an observation on how to come about this issue. I think for Rand, rights are primarily principles about how to organize society. And so she's not really interested when she's talking about rights, primarily in the question of why is it in the individual's interest to follow these rights? That's not the kind of direct thing she's thinking about. Rather, the idea is as an individual, it's in your interest to live together with other individuals in the kind of society that enables individuals to thrive. And so then it's in your interest to figure out what principles enable that type of a society. And then we want to think about, well, what do individuals need to survive and to thrive in a social context? And rights are the principles that they need. And so that's why the focus is on what the individual needs in a social context whenever she's talking about rights, and not on why you should do what an individual needs in the social context. It's about how to organize society. But then if you want to think about why should I obey rights if I'm in a society that is organized around them? Why I want to be in such a society should be clear, but why should I obey them if I'm in such a society? Well, there's a lot of things one can say about that, but I think the central one is that her view of human beings is not essentially competitive, right? It's not essentially that you are you benefit from other people's failures. Indeed, the opposite is true. Other people doing well is good for you. There's a harmony of interests among rational human beings. This is a kind of deeper principle of her ethics, and it's part and parcel of her whole view of egoism. And it's out of this that flows the idea that if there's principles are going to apply to everyone and have to apply consistently to everyone. So in the essay, I go into kind of real detail about how her ethics works and concretize, how exactly you would be frustrating your own interests by violating rights. But I don't want to try to take the time to do that here. But I do want to flag that as an issue. I don't think we need to go into that issue further in this course because it's not a course on her moral philosophy per se, and it's a course on how ought a society to be organized so that individuals can flourish in it, that individuals can live the human type of life in it. But if you're interested in the ethical question of, well, then why obey the law if you are in that society? Why, then, I recommend this forthcoming piece to you if you could wait till March. There are a few questions that relate to what we've been saying in the Q&A that I think maybe we should answer. So, Ankar, let me just put them to you, and I might then have some follow-ups on them. Jeremy asks if a good summation of what we've been saying is, so there are some things that are right, adjective, in a social context, which then creates a right noun for the individual.
I mean, I think you can look at it like that. I find that too linguistic. Because it's not an issue of a verb and a noun. It's an issue of a moral perspective that you're bringing in thinking about society, so that you're grasping that there's certain things that are right, that is, they're the way in which a human being survives. And you're looking at it at a fairly abstract. So you're not looking at an individual and, well, he wants to be an engineer, so he's got to do this and that. You're looking at it, you're abstracting from those kinds of things and thinking of you're trying to identify conditions that are true of every individual, qua an individual, that these are things that are right. He has to be able to engage in these actions, or engaging in these actions are the kinds of actions he has to take in order to advance his life. And then you're putting, when she talks about rights as a concept, you're conceptualizing that, okay, this is a condition. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of trade, these are conditions that an individual needs that he needs to be able, that these conditions need to be protected so that he can exercise his judgment and he can act in pursuit of his own happiness. And so that it is a concept, and you're conceptualizing it and you're packaging it together. We've identified some crucial conditions that have to be met and have to be secured and protected. So you can, there is an aspect of it as a verb noun, but I think you have to get beyond that to get the real phenomenon of what is going on.
The way I would tweak this statement, if we're going to use this verb noun language, is Jeremy puts it, there are some things that are right in a social context, which then creates a right for the individual. I would say there are some things that it's right for the individual to do. And so within a social context, that creates a right for him to do them. So because it's right for him to act in a certain way, again, identifying that way in fundamental terms, in a social context, it's a condition of his being able to function in the social context that he is free to do those things. And then his right is the, well, that brings us to the next question, his right noun. And so the next question is, Schuyler asks, so is a right not just something one has, but something one does?
I mean, the does aspect of it is, it's the normal conceptualization, which I think is right, is that you exercise it. So you talk about the exercise of an individual's rights, and that means that the conditions have been secured and protected such that he now can act by, I mean, Greg put it unilaterally, he can act by his own judgment without seeking permission, approval from others. And then when he's so acting, you're saying he's exercising his rights because now he's exercising the freedom of action that has already been secured and protected. So I think that's the way, it's not something you do, but it's you exercise. I think that that's the right way of formulating it.
Yeah, the one way of describing a right is a principle sanctioning your freedom of action. You could also describe the right as that which is sanctioned by the principle. So it's a sphere of freedom of action, a sphere in which you could act unilaterally. And that's what one has, a sphere in which one can properly act unilaterally, in which one should be able to act unilaterally. And then that right is secured when, in fact, one is safe from anyone interfering in your ability to act unilaterally within that sphere. And so what it is to have a right is to have a sphere in which one should be secure from other people's interfering in your action. And then for your rights to be secured is for that you, in fact, to be free from other people within that sphere. And then here's a question from James, which I think is interesting. This has been up here for a while, but I think is maybe a way of trying to get at what we've been saying across the whole session so far. Could you formulate the principle in question, an inductive generalization in the form all S is P, and identify the causal basis of the principle? So I could give that a shot. Do you want to try?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I wouldn't put it in the all S is P form exactly, because I think the more fundamental way to put the principle is sort of S by its nature is P, or an S is P, and then it therefore applies to all S's. But what is the generalization? An individual should be free to take the actions his life requires when in society. Or an individual's ability to take the actions his life requires should not be impeded or should be secure when he's in society. Or to go further, broader than that, a society can be judged by, right, whether it protects or imposes on an individual's ability to take the actions that his life requires. So that's the principle, right? That this individual should, in the social context, be free to do this. And then what is the causal basis of the principle? Well, the causal basis of the principle is that the thing that we saw when we looked at that passage of the basis is not divine law or congressional law, but metaphysical law, the law of identity, A is A. Human beings have a certain nature. We need to survive. We can only survive in a certain way. There is a human way of life. That way of life requires certain actions. So if a human being is to survive, and that set of facts is what gives rise on Rand's view to morality in the first place. So if a human being is to survive, if a human being is going to live, then he needs to do it in this way, and it's right for him to do it in this way. And if there is to be a society, if it's right for human beings to live in that society, then the society ought to leave them and protect for them that sphere of freedom.
And I wanted to say a word about the issue of a little more about the causal basis, because I think it's often oversimplified, and including by people sort of fans of Ayn Rand reading this essay, to think that all the thinking is about morality. So it's about these are the conditions that are required by an individual human being in order to be pursuing his life and happiness. That has to be really studied, and to say these are the conditions, these are causal conditions, and you're thinking a lot about cause and effect. But the same is true in looking at societies. And so both the Enlightenment thinkers and the founding fathers, they're looking at different forms of government, different forms of social organization, and thinking about the causality involved. How do these actually function? How does an individual actually live in these different forms of government, of society, of different laws? And is he able to perform the kinds of actions that morally we're coming to think he has to be able to perform these actions? And there's a lot of thinking just about the nature of government, studying different forms of government, different constitution, different laws, to think about the causality involved in social organization. So it's both of those, and then they're being integrated. And that, I mean, it's a massive undertaking and a massive achievement to get, I think, anywhere close to the right view in regard to this.
Yeah, and if you look at the passage from Atlas Shrugged after that paragraph that's quoted from Atlas Shrugged, it talks again about the causal consequences on a society of violating these rights, of not being organized in accordance with these rights, and what it is about human nature and society that that makes that the case. Why, and ultimately what it is that human beings need to live by their own minds, that the mind doesn't function under coercion. And this is something we're going to talk about next time. And therefore that a society that doesn't leave people free of coercion is not going to be able to function, is going to be poor, and everyone's life in it is going to be not tedious, but teetering. I'm losing. I can't put my finger on the word I want, but perilous. Tentative. That's not the word, but anyway. I want to say something about the question about when rights begin, but let's do the pseudo rights first. Just say a few words about them, and we'll have occasion to discuss them more in subsequent sessions. Do you want to take that, and I'll take the rights begin question?
Yeah, so I'll just say something very quickly. And if there's more questions about this kind of issue, you can post them in the Facebook group, and we'll have a chance then to chime in there. But it relates to the issue of positive and negative, that rights are a sanction of a positive, of the type of action you should be free to take in society. The negative obligation is to refrain from interfering and to be consistent in the upholding of rights. And the they're pseudo concepts. I mean, she compares it to using counterfeit money. And there's a principle in economics that bad money drives out good. So if you start using counterfeit money, then it drives out good money, because if all you need is a fake dollar bills to buy stuff and so on, why would you use your actual money to do it? So no one starts using it, and the real money disappears. And here she thinks of it as they're pretending that these are rights, just like the right to life or the right to liberty, the right to freedom of thought or freedom of speech. But you can't put them in the same category of, and she calls them so-called economic rights. And one way of looking at them is that they all require positive action from other people. So if you have a right to a job, then someone has to give you a job. That is, someone has to offer you a job and employ you. And that's imposing on him, he has to take these actions, or someone in society has to take these actions. And if A doesn't do it and B doesn't do it and C doesn't do it, then we're going to have to force someone to do it because this person has a right to a job. And so any kind of alleged right that's requiring a positive action on the part of another person, or including the turning over of his property, she thinks of as it's undermining the very concept of rights, because what they're about is trying to identify the freedom of action that an individual should be able to take. And now all of a sudden you're using rights to deny people various aspects of the freedom of action that they should be in possession of. So that's a word. I mean, we don't have a lot of time, but that's a word on the issue.
Yeah, I think we'll have a lot more to say about it when we look at the particulars of intellectual freedom in session 6 and of property rights in session 5. I've put up a question on Facebook as part of the unit, a part of this unit, for follow-ups to the material we've discussed here in this first session. So we haven't gotten to all the questions, and there were a lot of good ones that are being asked online. So we'll be in this group over the course of the week, and we may respond to questions you put under that post, or if not, we may respond to them next week in the session if they wouldn't derail us from getting to the stuff that's meant for next week. Let me just say a word about a question that was asked that I think comes up often and is maybe an occasion to bring up some of what's distinctive about Rand's view that we talked about before. Schuyler asks, when does one's right to life begin? At birth? Before birth? The current conservatives, right, talk about a lot about a right to life and are interested in the right to life, and almost all they seem to mean by it, or be particularly interested in it, is the alleged right of fetuses to live, or of brain dead people, or people not to be euthanized. When does the right to life begin, and how can we tell? And I would say you have to go back to this idea of rights are principles defining an action and sanctioning freedom of action in a social context. Something that's in something, or someone, even if you want to call it that, that's in a woman's uterus, connected to her by an umbilical cord, sucking nutrients out of her, and probably couldn't live without her, or even if it's far enough along that it could, it isn't living without her, is not a thing that exists yet in a social context as a distinct individual. A social context is the context where you have different individuals separate from one another that are interacting, and such that they can act on one another. And the question is, by what principles should they interact? Should they act with one another? And what freedoms should they have? And so until something's physically distinct and engaged in a life separate from the lives of biologically of any other organism, and yet in a society where there are other human beings around it, I don't think there's the kind of minimal context to discuss rights yet. Now, of course, an infant or even an older child isn't able to live fully on its own. And so in that sense, it can't have the freedoms it requires and can use are not as wide as the range of freedoms that you and I require and can use, and that we need to live. But I think when you think about rights as applying to man or to the human being as such, you have to think about a human being as an organism that develops from, first a single fertilized cell to a fetus to being given birth to, and it's a baby, and then growing up to a human being, and eventually it gets older and goes into decline and dies, and often has a period in its dotage where it's more like a child again. So you have to think of that whole thing as a human being, and recognize that a human being kind of fade in and fade out of existence, so to speak. But what are the implications of that for the concept of rights? Well, I think, first of all, the concept doesn't even get a grip until we're dealing with separate creatures, separate organisms, and separate organisms that aren't just separate in their DNA or their heartbeat, but are like spatially distinct from one another, such that one could act on one without acting on the other. And that's just not possible when one's inside of the other, feeding off of it. And then once you do have spatially distinct organisms, then we need to make reference to the principle by which we as human beings have to deal with one another in a society, to figure out, make reference to that principle in light of the fact that our abilities fade in and sometimes fade out over time, to think about how we ought to treat individuals at a given time and need to treat individuals at a given time in light of that. So although a child or a mentally handicapped person or a very old and senile person isn't capable of all of the actions that a functioning, healthy adult human being can perform, and needs to have things done for him and can't be free in the way that a functioning, healthy adult human being can perform. Because he is a human being and something that is developing towards this state, or would normally be if something hadn't gone wrong with him, we need to take that into account in deciding what to do with him now. And the burden of proof needs to be on us to show that this person isn't capable of, or this category of person, young person, isn't capable of living in a fully human way yet, or functioning in a human way. And we need to think about how to deal with them in light of that. Ankar, any further last thoughts on this kind of demarcation issue of who rights applies to, when they begin, and how we can tell?
I mean, we're out of time, so I'll just say one other thing, that it's the perspective of individual rights as principles, and principles operative in a social context and for social organization, helps get, I mean, what you've been talking about, Greg, is that these are derivative, even thinking about children and the mentally handicapped, these are derivative issues. And there's a reason why they're derivative, because the essence of it is adult human beings who are capable of reasoning and thinking about social organization and its proper principles. It's how do we define these? And then you have, and then there's kids who can't participate in this as well. How does what we've formulated all this, how does it apply in that case, or to someone who's had a brain injury and now can no longer but there's a reason why they're derivative. And the natural rights and the, as you put it before, the more intrinsic, like they're just in nature. It's, well, the person either possesses rights or they don't, and it's like stamped on them, and that's all we have to look for. And that's not if you're thinking of them as principles formulated to perform a task, that's not the right perspective to have on it.
They're the principles that we organize our society by, so that we can engage in the business of living. And so they're about, and the primary case of them is in reference to those of us who can engage in the business of living when we're in our prime and fully able to do it. And then we think back, given that we have a life cycle, well, then how do we extend those principles to people who are just starting out or fading out, or who have had some tragedy and can't do it?
Right.
So that's it for this week, now, or for today, rather. On Thursday, just 2 days from now, we'll be back to talk about another of Rand's classic essays on political philosophy, The Nature of Government. Any other last thoughts?
No, I mean, thanks everyone for attending, and thanks for all the questions and comments. And I hope you're able to rejoin us on Thursday.